I'm Tom, 38 years old. I recently lost my wife, Sarah, to a sudden illness. It's been tough, but my 8-year-old daughter, Diane, is what keeps me going. The nights are the hardest, especially now that I'm working the night shift as a security guard at Willow Creek Psychiatric Facility. The pay is good, and I need the money to cover the bills after everything Sarah went through. Willow Creek is an old hospital on the edge of town. People say it's haunted, with plenty of ghost stories going around. The place has long-term patients with serious mental health issues, people with nowhere else to go. On my first night, my boss, Henry, mentioned that most nights were quiet. The patients stayed locked up, the staff kept to themselves, and I just had to watch the monitors. It seemed simple enough, and I liked that I wouldn't have to deal with people. Not something I was ready for after losing Sarah. 3 weeks into the job, I was in the small, dim security room, surrounded by monitors showing different parts of the hospital. I had gotten used to the glow of the screens and the distant patient sounds. It was almost 3 a.m., the time when things just feel a bit off. I was sipping my lukewarm coffee, trying to stay awake, when something caught my eye on one of the monitors, a flicker of movement in the hallway outside Ward C. I leaned in, adjusting the screen's brightness. A man in a hospital gown moved slowly down the hallway. His long, messy hair hung as he hunched over. The patients were supposed to be locked in their rooms at this hour. I checked the clipboard. Ward C had some of the most dangerous patients, people who could hurt themselves or others. The man stopped outside room 304 and turned towards the camera. His face was hollow, eyes dead but filled with anger. I grabbed the intercom, my hands unsteady. I told him to return to his room. He didn't move. Instead, he started walking towards the security room, towards me. Something was wrong. I hit the emergency button, but nothing happened. I pressed it again, but the light stayed off. I looked for my radio, but it must have fallen behind the desk. The man was getting closer, and with each step, the camera started glitching, his image flickering on and off. I looked at the door to the security room. It was locked, but knowing he was right outside made me uneasy. The hallway lights flickered and went out, and the monitors went black, leaving me in darkness. I reached for the flashlight on my belt, fumbling to turn it on. The narrow beam barely cut through the dark, but it was enough to see the door handle. It was slowly turning. I stepped back. The handle rattled, then stopped, and everything went silent. Then the banging started, loud and steady, like someone was throwing themselves against the door. His low, growling voice repeated the same words again and again. "Stop watching me. Stop watching me." The door shook with each hit. I needed an escape. The vent. I turned and saw the small vent near the floor on the other side of the room. I dropped to my knees and unscrewed the cover with my flashlight. The banging grew louder and more desperate. I pulled the cover off and squeezed myself into the vent. It was tight, my shoulders scraping the metal as I crawled, my breathing echoing. I crawled as fast as I could, the flashlight clamped between my teeth, when I heard the door burst open. The man was inside. I crawled faster. I could hear his bare feet slapping against the floor, his voice still repeating, "Stop watching me." I reached the end of the vent and kicked the cover off. It fell, and I dropped into an empty patient room, landing hard. Pain shot through my leg, but I forced myself up, limping to the door. I opened it a little and peeked out. The hallway was empty. I slipped out of the room quietly, needing to find help. The hospital felt like a maze, hallways stretching endlessly, flickering lights casting shadows. I turned a corner and froze. There he was, at the far end of the hallway, his back to me. He stood still, his head tilted like he was listening for something. I moved back and the floor creaked. His head snapped around, empty eyes locking onto mine. He smiled and started moving towards me, faster. I ran, limping and stumbling. Doors blurred as I pushed forward, his footsteps close behind. I burst through a set of double doors into the main lobby. The exit was ahead, the glass doors leading outside. I focused on the glowing exit sign and pushed harder. I slammed into the doors, stumbling out into the freezing night air. and kept running until I collapsed on the grass. I looked back at the building, but the doorway was empty. The night was silent except for my breathing. A few minutes later, the staff found me, their flashlights cutting through the dark. I tried to explain what happened, but the words wouldn't come out clearly. They took me back inside, but the man was gone. The monitors were working again, the lights were back on, and there was no sign anyone had been in the security room. I quit that night. Whatever had happened, ghost, patient, or just my own mind, I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to think of Diane. I needed to be there for her, to protect her from whatever darkness was out there. But even now, months later, I still see his face. In window reflections, in the shadows of my room at night, those empty, angry eyes staring at me. As a paramedic and father of 2 boys, I've seen things that most people could never imagine, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was late December, a cold night with empty streets. My partner, Sam, and I were working the night shift, just trying to get through without anything too crazy happening. The call came in around 2 a.m. Emergency at 112 Quarry Lane. Possible cardiac arrest. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Sam and I exchanged a tired look before switching on the lights and sirens. The address was in an area we rarely visited, old houses near the edge of town, surrounded by woods. When we pulled up, the house looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and the front yard was overgrown. I thought there had to be a mistake, but we had a job to do. We grabbed our gear and headed to the front door, which was slightly open. "Hello? Paramedics!" Sam called out as we stepped inside. The air was heavy and smelled musty, with a rotten odor lingering. There was no response, just the creak of the floorboards under our feet. We moved through the hallway, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. I could see my breath in the cold air. We found her in the living room, an elderly woman lying on the floor, eyes closed. She looked frail, dressed in an old nightgown. I knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. Her skin was ice cold, and I knew she was gone. Still, I went through the motions, CPR, the defibrillator, while Sam called it in. As I worked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just the dark, empty house, the shadows flickering as our flashlights moved. "Jake, let's call it," Sam said quietly, and I nodded. There was nothing more we could do. I sat back on my heels, catching my breath, when I heard it. A soft creaking noise, like someone walking on the floor above us. Sam looked at me. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. We both stood up, our flashlights aimed at the ceiling. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above us. Someone was up there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unsteady. "This is the paramedics. If you need help, please come downstairs." Silence. The creaking stopped. Sam and I exchanged a look, and without a word, we started towards the stairs. Each step creaked loudly as we climbed, the sound echoing through the house. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with closed doors. The air felt colder as I gripped the flashlight. We moved slowly, checking each room. They were all empty, just dusty furniture covered in sheets, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. With every step, the feeling that we weren't alone got stronger. We reached the last door at the end of the hallway. It was closed, unlike the others, and something about it felt wrong. I looked at Sam, and he nodded. I reached out, turning the knob slowly. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a small, dark room. It was empty, except for a single rocking chair in the middle of the room, facing the window. The chair was moving, rocking slowly back and forth, even though there was no breeze. "We need to leave, now," Sam said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't argue. We backed out of the room, eyes fixed on the rocking chair. We needed to leave. We turned and hurried back down the hallway, practically running down the stairs. As we reached the front door, I heard it again, The creaking, the slow, deliberate footsteps, this time coming down the stairs behind us. I didn't look back. I grabbed Sam's arm and we ran out of the house, slamming the door behind us. We didn't stop until we were back in the ambulance, the doors locked, the engine running. We sat there for a moment, trying to catch our breath, eyes fixed on the house. The front door was still closed, the windows dark. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, nothing. It was like the house had swallowed everything whole, leaving only the silence of the night. We reported the death, but we didn't mention what we heard or saw. Who would believe us? An old, abandoned house, a dead woman, and footsteps in the dark. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. I haven't been back to that part of town since. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. And I wonder if, somewhere in that old house, the rocking chair is still moving, back and forth, waiting for the next visitor. It was a quiet Wednesday night, and I had just started my night shift at the small-town diner. The place was old, with cracked vinyl booths and a flickering neon sign buzzing outside. The only customers at this hour were the regulars, Old Hank, who sipped black coffee and read the newspaper, and Sheila, the waitress who'd been there for as long as anyone could remember. I liked the quiet. It was peaceful, and the routine was comforting. The clock on the wall ticked past 1 a.m., and the bell above the door caught my attention. I looked up, expecting to see one of the usual late-night drifters, but instead, a young man walked in. He looked nervous and out of place. He was wearing a dark hoodie, with the hood pulled up, and his face was hard to see. He moved hesitantly, glancing around like he wasn't sure what to do. Sheila gave him a polite nod, and he took a seat at the counter, 2 stools down from me. Sheila asked if he wanted coffee, already reaching for the pot. The young man nodded without saying a word. Sheila poured his coffee, then went back to wiping down the counter, glancing at him every now and then. I couldn't help but notice his hands. They were shaking a little as he picked up the cup, and his eyes kept darting to the window like he was waiting for someone. I asked if he was okay, trying to keep my voice calm. He looked over at me, his eyes wide. He didn't answer. He just looked back down at his coffee. The doorbell chimed again, and this time, 2 men walked in. They were big, with tough expressions, moving with a purpose that immediately set me on edge. They definitely didn't look like they were there for a late-night snack. They scanned the room, their eyes locking onto the young man at the counter. He stiffened as they came closer. One of them spoke to the young man, his voice low and mean, asking if he thought he could really get away. The young man didn't move. He stared straight ahead, gripping the edge of the counter tightly. I could feel the tension rise as the seconds ticked by, each moment stretching longer than the last. The room went silent, everyone watching. Sheila gave me a worried look. I told them they should take it somewhere else, trying to keep my voice steady. The 2 men ignored me. One of them reached out, grabbed the young man by the shoulder, and yanked him off the stool. The sudden movement made everyone in the diner hold their breath. The coffee cup fell and shattered on the floor. Old Hank looked up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing. The young man finally whispered, asking them to leave him alone. The bigger of the 2 men sneered, saying the young man owed them, and they couldn't just let him go. He shoved the young man toward the door. Without thinking, I stood up. I shouted for them to leave him alone, my voice echoing in the quiet diner, louder than I had intended. Everyone froze for a moment. The 2 men turned to look at me, their faces darkening. One of them growled that it wasn't my business and stepped closer. I told them they weren't going to drag him out like that. The diner went completely still, all eyes on us, the air thick with anticipation. It felt like time had slowed, and everyone was waiting for the next move. Sheila had her hand on the phone, ready to call the cops, and Old Hank had put down his newspaper, watching with a serious expression. The young man looked at me, hopeful. The 2 men exchanged a look, their expressions unreadable. After what felt like forever, they let go of the young man, the tension slowly releasing as they backed off. One of them pointed a finger at him, warning they would be back, before they turned and walked out. The bell chimed as the door closed behind them. The young man let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping as he sat back down on the stool. The fear still evident, but the immediate danger gone. Sheila moved closer and gently asked if he was okay. He nodded and whispered a thank you. He looked over at me and I could see he was grateful. I told him it was no problem and to take care of himself, my hands still a bit shaky. He nodded again, and for the first time, a small smile appeared on his face. Sheila poured him another cup of coffee, and the diner slowly returned to normal. Old Hank picked up his newspaper. Sheila went back to wiping down the counter, and the young man sat quietly, sipping his coffee as the tension faded away. I knew this wasn't the end for him, but for tonight at least, he was safe. And sometimes, that's all you can hope for.